This video is an attempt to provide organizing principles for understanding the human and planetary condition. It might be meaningful to you if you're experiencing some form of angst or trauma about climate change, war, a virus, energy stability, or the economy. It will definitely be meaningful to you if you could never have imagined living in the world that we're living in now. We're going to attempt to provide a single, simple answer to the question of why any particular world event is happening. Now, this series is based on my best current understanding, and I've put a huge amount of work into this, but I may still have something wrong. So let me know in the comments or via email if you have something to add or if I need to correct my thinking. So this is a three-part video series, and in this part one, we'll look at the patterns which have appeared over and over in the past 8,000 years. It's not particularly good news. But in the next video, we'll explore what we can expect, and it's decidedly better news than what we'll cover in this video. And then in the final video, we'll attempt to answer the question of, well, what should we do given the situation that we face? Now, there's a huge amount to unpack in this series, and we'll cover a lot of ground. It might appear overwhelming, but it's necessary. What we've noticed is that too many people dive straight into problem solving without understanding the problem space. And that's why it's been said, if I only had 1 hour to solve a problem, I would spend up to 2/3 of that hour in attempting to define what the problem is. So the first two parts of this video series is about defining the problem, and only in the last one do we look at potential solutions. So this video series attempts to navigate the nexus of energy, food, water, war, disease, climate, and human progress. We believe that it is this nexus that should be more deeply explored by analysts, systems thinkers, podcasters, and independent journalists. This video series is simply an attempt to get the conversation going. Please pause the video if you need to. There are links to extensive supporting information that can be found in the video description. So to kick off, let's conduct a thought experiment. You'll know that when you peel a pineapple, you're left with those little black dots. They're called eyes. Now imagine that each of the eyes on the pineapple represents just one of the many challenges our civilization faces. And this list is certainly not comprehensive. Forgive me if I've left your favorite challenge out. But the question we're exploring is there a pattern that connects all of the dots? And the reason we ask that question is because we believe that by identifying and addressing patterns could be more effective than addressing these individual symptoms. So here's a brief video that shows how pineapples are peeled in Asia. And you'll notice how they see the pattern connecting all the eyes. And once they can see that pattern, they more effectively achieve their objective, which is a totally clean pineapple with no black dots on it. So that's what we're going to do in this video, is look for patterns so that we can more efficiently achieve our objective, which is a world that works for everyone. So why look for patterns? Well, they provide clarity when navigating a very noisy and very complex world. And once seen, those patterns can't be unseen. In other words, we want our default thinking to be a search for patterns. And once we can automatically see patterns, then we can more efficiently address the challenges we see around us. But the question is, why do we even need this discussion? Surely our future is green already. There's so many people working on technological solutions to our planet's challenges, but we don't have to concern ourselves. There's wind farms, solar farms, electric vehicles, carbon capture and storage. Well, we believe that there is seriously flawed thinking around climate change, renewable energy, sustainability, and net zero. And we know that there's a growing number of people who feel the same. So we believe that in order to truly understand our predicament and not make things worse, we need a clear-headed ecological interpretation of history. Up until now, those of us who know that something is wrong, we've been a little afraid to criticize the perceived wisdom of the masses. We've been too scared to point out that the wisdom is just like the emperor, actually stark naked. Now, if we get this right, by the end of this video series, we'll have the right information so that we can confidently shout that the emperor has no clothes when the situation calls for it. And we're going to do this without quoting endless facts. We know that statistics can be used to prove almost anything these days. Instead, we're going to tell a story of human progress. So let's dive in. So the three key themes we'll explore in this part one of the changing world order are the 275-year cycle that humanity appears to repeat, and then where we are in that cycle, and then what can we expect next. But first, a quote. Every few hundred years in Western history, there occurs a sharp transformation. Within a few short decades, society, that means its worldview, its basic values, its social and political structure, its key institutions, in fact, everything about society rearranges itself. And 50 years later, there is a new world, and people born then cannot even imagine the world in which their grandparents lived. We are currently living through such a time. So over the past 8,000 years, we've seen a cycle which lasts anywhere between 225 and 325 years. The average is 275, so we simplify it to that. Now, the cycle is only valid for class-based societies, not values-based, and we'll discuss the difference between class and values-based in the next video. But for now, this cycle is highly applicable to the world that we've been accustomed to, at least if you're in the West. And there are 7 distinct phases for each cycle, and let's dive into each phase to see what takes place in each. So it kicks off with a highly functioning society where there is very high social cohesion and all of the citizens are in touch with nature. Everything is pretty stable. There's a huge amount of productive work going on, low debt, and very few inequalities with very little private property. It's an egalitarian society, which means it's very balanced and equal. And then at some point, a desire for growth pops up its head, and so credit is introduced to fund that growth. Credit is borrowing from the future, but it allows enterprises to flourish, and as a result, governance and resource allocation systems are built. So that's governments and economies. And then you have a long period of growth, peace, and prosperity. But that growth ultimately leads to overconsumption, and that's stealing resources from the future. And this is where debt and socioeconomic inequalities increase. And that eventually leads to the 5th stage, where you have the rise of the 1% in a class-based society. Taxes on the rich reduce while taxes on the rest of the citizenry rockets. And that's when productivity plunges and you start seeing laziness and arrogance in society. And it's that point that real signs of weakness start appearing in the economy. Up until then, the economy has gone up and down, but now we see systemic issues in the economy. As the weaknesses in the economy raise their head, there's appropriation of the last remaining resources by the rich and powerful. There's a huge suppression of information with censorship occurring regularly. And it's at this stage that the 1% attempt to control the population by applying all kinds of ridiculous rules and restrictions. And these restrictions always lead to protests and civil war and ultimately revolution. Now, from history, we've seen that always these efforts at suppression ultimately backfire. You go through a fairly unpleasant period, but ultimately all of those efforts backfire. And that then leads to the emergence of the next order. The next order is established, and it's usually driven by grassroots movements, the same people that felt oppressed as increasing restrictions were imposed. So it's important to remember that this pattern has repeated over and over again with stark similarities. What that means is we can learn from this pattern. There's just a brief list of some of the empires that very closely followed this cycle. So where are we in that cycle? And we use 1776 as a marker for the start of the West's cycle. And that's because throughout that year, there were a number of protests and revolutions happening all across America, called the American Revolution. And it was during this time that Thomas Paine is said to have said, "These are the times that try men's souls." And I'm pretty sure you'd agree over the past 2-3 years, there have been times that have tried humanity's soul. So we're in a very similar kind of situation. That year concluded with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where the US achieved their independence from Great Britain. And at the same time, in London, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, and it's widely accepted that that's one of the core foundational textbooks of capitalism as we know it today. Now, interestingly, after the September 11th disaster, when they rebuilt One World Trade Center, they built it to exactly 1776 feet high. In commemoration of that was the start, the birth of their nation. So we've exceeded the shortest length of these patterns by 21 years, and we've got 29 years to go before we reach the average length of 275 years. And then we have 79 years to go before we exceed the longest length of 325 years. Now, that's just to give an indication that we are very much in the last phase of this cycle. One can't make accurate predictions about when exactly the final collapse happens, and a collapse usually happens over a decade or more, but it helps give an indication that we are near the end of this cycle. So what are some of the features of stage 6? Firstly, the currency is hugely devalued, and what that translates into is to skyrocketing prices. And you've seen that when you go to the grocery store. Increasing attempts to control citizens, as we've spoken about, and that results in protests, and we've seen many protests happening around the world as a result of that increase of control. There's a decrease in truth, honesty, and transparency, so much so that the phrase post-truth was chosen as the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year in 2016. So we're living in a post-truth era now. And it's at that point that values and morals of the society collapses, and that erodes the integrity of the common good. Where we had faith in the system before, we now no longer have that same level of faith. And this is where the grab of last resources by the rich and powerful results in overshoot. Now, the worst thing about this stage 6 is this post-truth phase, because there can no longer be intelligent debate. When the emperor's clothes are mentioned, you're invariably called as conspiracy theorist or a climate denier or any of a range of labels. So dissent is shut down immediately, and one can't have intelligent debate. So we've mentioned the phrase overshoot, and what are some of the features of those? Well, the first is we get aquifer depletion. We haven't quite reached that point with water wars yet, but that's as a result of bottling companies siphoning out the water instead of leaving it in the ground. Deforestation is usually caused by beef production, palm oil, wooden furniture, and coffee. There are obviously many other commodities, but those are the primary ones. Soil degradation is as a result of industrial agriculture. Overfishing has occurred in all of our oceans. And then enforced pandemic responses, which is what we've seen over the past 2 years. The most worrying one is that we then get to extreme extraction. So in the past, we had mining and oil. That was plain extraction. Now we're into extreme extraction, which means fracking and enhanced oil recovery, as well as carbon capture and storage. We'll discuss this more in video 3 when we talk about energy. But it's the normal types of extraction now go into top gear almost. And then the final one is war. And we know that war is a grab of last resources, not only of the nation that's being invaded, but if we look at the Ukraine war currently, prices of fuel have rocketed, but so have the profits of energy companies. And usually that's as a result of speculation by traders and so on. At the moment, we can see there's a Don't Pay campaign that has started in the UK, where they're looking for 1 million people to boycott their energy companies by the 1st of October. This is an example of the citizenry rising up in protest because they're unhappy with what's, and we'll see more and more of that happening. Now, note that none of these activities that we've listed here, which are features of overshoot, they have nothing to do with the activities of the citizens themselves. As part of a post-truth era, you'll notice that responsibility is often attempted to be placed on the citizenry, but all of these activities are funded by the powerful, and we'll come back to that as well. Now, the question in the face of behavior like this that results in overshoot, the question is why? Why do we inflict such obvious ecological destruction, and why does that behavior continue? Well, the question is often posed, what goes through the mind of the person who cuts down the last remaining tree? The person on Easter Island that cut the last remaining tree, were they concerned that there were no other trees? And we try and find a logical answer for this. Similarly, what goes through the minds of those who preach at us from the World Economic Forum platform? Well, I came across this quote some time ago. People of privilege will always risk their complete destruction rather than surrender any material part of their advantage. So it seems that a form of insanity sets in once you've climbed the ladder of a class-based society. And the phrase for this characteristic is called hubris, and we'll come across this term again shortly. But the biggest takeaway for us is that we must expect the kind of behavior we see from certain world leaders. The same has happened many times before. You can think of Emperor Nero and Rome, Antony and Cleopatra, Hitler and Russia, Catherine the Great and her horse, or more recently John Merriweather of LTCM and Kenneth Lay of Enron, for those who can remember the collapse of those companies. So it seems that the course of world events is determined less by conspiracy than it is by stupidity and hubris. It seems that pride always comes before the fall. And we'll come back to this idea. So as we wrap up this video, the first video in our series, here are some recommended resources on this idea of the 275-year cycle. And links to all of these can be found in the description. And if you've got any recommendations of additional resources, please leave a comment. So the first is highly recommended, Overshoot by William Catton, because it explains how any challenge that we see in society, in civilization, it can be traced back to the concept that we have just stolen resources from future generations. It's called Overshoot. And it examines how we've long ago overshot the Earth's capacity to support our current consumption. The easiest way of describing Overshoot is that image of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner cartoon, where he invariably runs off a cliff. It takes him a second or two before he realizes and then plummets. And we're in that awkward period now when we realize the inevitability of past actions, and then the fall comes. The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter is a meta-analysis. A number of fairly significant volumes of work have been researched and analyzed by him, and he develops a new theory that accounts for collapse. And many of the patterns that came from this book is what we've used to produce this video. Immoderate Greatness is a great little book that discusses in more detail this concept of hubris. And hubris is excessive pride and self-confidence. It's when someone gets so high on their own technical genius that they can no longer see straight. And the book concludes by saying the deliberate renunciation of hubris is the only way out to avoid collapse, and it never happens. We include this collection of books by Amin Maalouf, who is one of the Arab world's most influential writers. He writes in Arabic, French, and English, and we include these just to show that it's not only a Western concern, it's certainly covered in the East as well. The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio, who's an American billionaire businessman and hedge fund manager. He spent a lot of time analyzing these patterns because in order to get his investments right, he has to understand what's coming as part of a pattern. And interestingly, in late June 2022, his company shorted a number of major European stocks, which means he's betting on a major collapse. He will lose money if a collapse doesn't happen. The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zeihan is a very sobering read indeed. And it focuses on two core issues. The first is energy, that the world is simply running out of energy, and our populations are all shrinking and aging. And it maps out what we can expect in the next world order with very much more local food production, less global trade, and new forms of national energy. And he criticizes renewable energy completely. We'll have that discussion in a future video as well. And then a very interesting video, 27-minute big picture summary. So it's not a book, but by Michael Dowd. He shows us how most of us alive today were born between where we see the two green stars on his slide. He calls that period Teotihuacan, which is the end of the world as we know it. So many of us were born as there was still significant progress. There was lots of development and improvement. We're now at the point where we're about to go into deep decline and collapse, and we will die after we've seen significant collapse. And it's an extremely rational explanation of the situation we're in now, but it leaves out one key missing factor, and that's the inevitable emergence of the next. It's a real shame because he keeps referring to the 80 past collapses, 80 plus. But if any of them were terminal, none of us would be here. So a collapse doesn't mean an extinction. It means the end of the world as we knew it. And our question is why spend so much time focusing on the regress, the fall, and the bust without at least mentioning what comes after. And so our focus is very much on the emergence, the good news that comes as a result of the collapse. Okay, so what have we covered so far? We've looked at the cycles that have repeated regularly over the past 8,000 years of human history. We've established that we're at stage 6, which is often called late stage civilizational collapse. And so the question is, well, what can we expect next? And that very much depends on whether we choose to focus on collapse or emergence. And we acknowledge that this video has not been particularly light-hearted. It can be challenging to stare into the abyss of collapse, and we know it's not easy. But we haven't yet spoken about that stage 7, which is the emergence of what always comes next. So video 2 will be far more inspiring, I promise. And then in video 3, we'll bring it all together to talk about potential solutions. So we hope to see you there, and thanks for watching. So what do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Please do drop a note in the comments or send us an email with your thoughts. What we're hoping to achieve with this series of videos is to catalyze discussion around the complex, interrelated topics of energy, war, disease, climate, and human progress. If you know someone who might be interested in these overlapping topics, please share this series with them. Thanks again for watching.